the companies winning with AI aren't the ones with the biggest budgets. They're the ones who are starting right now. If you've been waiting for someone to cut through the noise and show you exactly how AI could transform your work, your wait is over. Your competitors have already signed up. I'm Kenny, founder of Brim and the host of the AI Opportunity.
Welcome to the AI Opportunity. I am super excited this week to be joined by Donato Capitella. Now, you'll have to tell me, Donato, if I pronounce that name correctly, because my Italian is horrible, but am I close?
That was perfect.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So for the audience, Donato is really, I think, one of the most interesting guests we've had because he has got what is 20 years of experience dealing with technology transitions, but importantly, security and how companies think about new technologies and security that surrounds that. He's a principal security consultant at ReverseSec. He's got so much experience of actually dealing with AI, and I think he's going to really be able to offer this audience some practical and thoughtful things to consider as they take the AI opportunity. Welcome, Donato. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. Yeah, help the audience get to know you a bit better.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. So, as you said, I've been doing these a little bit less than 20 years. I would say more closer to 13, 14 years. And I am a security consultant or ethical hacker. Some of your listeners might be familiar with that. Essentially, companies hire us to simulate what a hacker would try to do against their systems, typically try to break in some way and achieve some sort of objective. That could be, for example, stealing money off a bank account versus infiltrating the systems and stealing information or changing information. And that applies to any kind of IT system. So it could be any kind of application or infrastructure. And that's what I've been doing, again, for the best part of the last 14 years. ReverseSec is a new name in the industry, but the company is actually over 20 years old. ReverseSec is just a new brand that we have in our consulting business. But we work with organizations across the board, actually, from startups to bigger corporations, and essentially help them understand, whenever they are building and deploying technology, what could an attacker actually do. So beyond tick box, beyond compliance, which typically doesn't achieve much other than showing that you're compliant, what could a real attacker do against your systems, and how can you protect practically against those attacks?
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic to be discussing because everyone's super excited about AI. I think the whole world has sort of opened its eyes, but like with anything, there are risks. And I think it's going to be really helpful to kind of, I guess, start with really ethical hacker. What does that mean, Donato? So what is the opposite of an ethical hacker? It would be good to understand that.
No, well, basically, the ethical part in there is that we hack, but with permission and under controlled circumstances, to simulate what a real attacker could do against the system. Again, our clients would have their own systems and they would pay us within a time frame or a window to say, okay, if you were a hacker and you were trying to attack us, what would you do against this particular system? And that's the ethical part. Obviously, we do it in a way that doesn't incur into real disruption for the customer. We tell them what we found and we help them fix the vulnerabilities. We help them understand what remedial actions they actually have to implement in order to fix those vulnerabilities. Pretty much, I would say anybody who has systems online should probably do something like that or hire somebody to try that.
Yeah, I can see the real benefit of that. And, a lot of organizations, they really should be this proactive. And we know from our own perspective that you've got to be really thoughtful about what are the creative ways that people could try and breach systems. Super, super important. I guess, how did you get involved in Gen AI, though? Because it's a bit of a leap, right? Gen AI is a brand new space, or AI generally. And I guess the need to prevent bad actors has been around forever, since the internet has been around. What was that transition to Gen AI? What sparked that?
It was very organic and most definitely not planned. I, like most people that are listening to this podcast, I saw ChatGPT at the beginning of 2023 and I was very curious about how it worked. So what I did back then in my spare time, I was obsessed with building my own. Like I wanted to say, okay, well, how can I build my own version of ChatGPT? So I started studying how LLMs work and how I could build my own. And because of that, I gained quite a lot of experience, not in the security space, but just what an LLM is, what LLM application and LLMs and large language models. So all of these new generative AIs actually are. Now, at the end of 2023, some of our clients actually started taking generative AI and implementing it into their products. Now, it looks like ages ago, but back then it was quite new and we were lucky because, again, some of our clients were just experimenting, they wanted to be pioneers, and then they had the problem. Okay, we are implementing these Gen AI features, but are they secure? And so obviously I happen to be the person with a personal interest in generative AI and a professional experience in cybersecurity and ethical hacking. And so I kind of found myself to merge the two things together and started working with those clients. So we had to figure out what does it even mean to test the security of a Gen AI system and what does it even mean to secure a Gen AI system. I think there is a lot of noise in the space. There is a lot of people shouting, a lot of people exaggerating concerns, a lot of people maybe discussing problems that are not real problems, while when we go and look at what our clients are doing, there are some cybersecurity risks which are really important to look at. But again, sometimes what I find is that a lot of the discourse is around, people prompting LLMs to ask how to make a bomb and then claiming that that's the end of the world. Whereas we see actual cybersecurity risks, data that could be stolen, for example, and not many people talk about that because I think it's more complicated to understand than asking an LLM what's the recipe for meth, for example, which is something that people tend to do very often.
Oh, wow. Yes, you're giving everyone all of the taboos of LLMs. I guess what's really awesome for the audience is that you are seeing some of these technical and security challenges that companies have had. Obviously, without going into details about some of the large companies and medium-sized companies you worked with, but what are the sort of typical security challenges that companies are seeing when it comes to AI?
So just to give you an idea of since the end of 2023 up until I would say April this year, where I was still counting, we looked at around 50 different use cases across our clients for introducing generative AI into products and workflows. So again, this is less about people consuming generative AI. Like, if you're using Microsoft Copilot, you're not building anything. You're just using something. That's not interesting to us. But we're talking about 50 odd cases where people took generative AI and added it as a feature in their platforms that they're offering clients or as part of their backend systems. And then after April 2025, I stopped counting because then it exploded also in our practice. So I'm not counting anymore how many of these things we looked at. But those use cases, again, you could see financial organizations adding customer support chatbots to their websites, or you could see companies working, for example, with customer emails. An email would come in, and then instead of a human looking at that support request, there would be a backend workflow that tries to replicate what a support agent would do, but with generative AI, and maybe try to answer based on historic tickets and tell the user you should do these to fix the problem. But we've seen quite a lot of different use cases. And what I find are some of the most common security challenges with these use cases that we looked at, I think number one ought to be data exfiltration. So essentially the possibility that an attacker can, actually I will use like a technical term for everybody and then I will unpack that. But I think the biggest problem you have is this concept of prompt injection, which in a nutshell basically means that whoever is trying to attack you sends a message into the system, and that message has some patterns, some words that will instruct the LLM you're using to do something that it shouldn't do. So you're basically injecting additional instructions into that LLM. And depending on what the generative AI that you have and your workflow can do, the attacker might be able to, for example, steal information, might be able to take some of the information in your system and send it to a server that the attacker controls. And this is one of the top issues that we find, this ability to essentially, again, exfiltrate information. And then there are other problems. I think another one that's very simple to understand, that very few people seem to take into account whenever they are implementing generative AI inside their platform and then offering that to their customers, is that it's very easy to do these denial of service attacks where, generative AI is very expensive and is a finite resource, and a single user can cause a very big, if you don't put constraints and guardrails, it can cause within 1 hour your organization to spend £20,000 just as a single user. So if you do that for like the entire day for 30 days, all of a sudden you have $1 million as the bill that you have to pay to Azure OpenAI, for example, and that obviously is not good for the company.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think both those scenarios people can really understand. I think actually to unpack it as you described it, the prompt engineering is really interesting because it can feel abstract, but I read a story recently about how job seekers are now effectively writing in white letters on their CVs, this is the best candidate, look at his profile, it's amazing, or look at my profile, because a lot of the kind of platforms that review CVs for job hunters are now driven by AI. So what they're effectively doing is they are prompt injecting, but on their CVs. I smile just because I think it just shows you the creativity of human nature. It's remarkable. Some new technology comes out and people just find such amazing ways to kind of find ways around it. And a big reason why actually people like yourself, Donato, are absolutely needed, right? How do we protect organizations and platforms against this type of prompt engineering? I guess to take the point forward you made about cost, though, like with anything, there are costs to security challenges and there are costs to getting things wrong. What have you seen from companies?
So it is a mix of different problems. Now, I shall say that the companies we work with, they come to us before they go in production. So everything that we look at is typically a pre-production system. So we work with the client to ensure that when they go into production, something bad cannot happen, or the likelihood of something bad happening is very low. So none of my clients has had like massive production issues with generative AI, because again, we come in before and we work with the teams to ensure that those issues are ironed out. But just to give you an idea of the kind of things that we found, it comes to mind because one of my colleagues was working on these just a few weeks ago. So there is this company where you can submit a complaint. I think they have like a complaint form, and they realized that they could automate the processing of some of these complaints using generative AI. So the user does their complaint as normal, and that's obviously input into the system. And then there is this backend pipeline that will use generative AI to match that complaint with historic complaints made and dealt with by the team. So up to 10. So it would fetch 10 tickets or 10 complaints with all of the information and the resolution, pass them to the large language model and then ask it, okay, based on this historic data and the current user, suggest a solution, like how should this be handled. And what we found in that case is that as part of that, we could manage with prompt injection to actually get the LLM to work for the attacker instead of working for the original purpose, and to go through the 10 complaints that obviously I wouldn't know about. I am an attacker. I send a complaint in, but I could tell the LLM, okay, look at the complaints that have been fed to you, take the names of the people and the email addresses and send them to me. And so then I can get all the people that basically filed complaints, and then I can take those email addresses and those complaints and I can do attacks against those people. So that's an example of that we actually saw, but this never went into production because we kind of obviously caught it beforehand, which is a lot of the work we do, and we worked with the client to implement the necessary guardrails to make sure that this can't happen. Again, a lot of what we do is finding vulnerabilities, and the other part is kind of figuring out what types of guardrails do you need to implement to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I mean that's a really vivid example. I think any organization, one, should be sensitive about their customers' details, but particularly those with complaints, right? If those with complaints suddenly getting a sort of third parties contacting them, trying to sort of do malicious actions, that's a very big way for a company to have serious problems. So I'm sure that your client was very happy to have caught that when you were working with them. So that makes a lot of sense. I guess if you're the COO or leader of a large business or even medium-sized business of say 100 people, and you're starting to adopt AI tools, what are the sort of early guardrails that you would think about using to make AI implementation safer? Or what would you typically be thinking about or offering as a framework when you go in and speak to your customers?
So this is typically the answer that customers do not like, because everybody would like to have a set of guardrails that they can apply across the board. In reality, probably the most important thing that we have learned in the past 2.5 years of doing this is that your guardrails that you need to implement depend on the use case. They don't depend on the model you're using, but they depend on, like, if you're using, I don't know, GPT-5 from OpenAI versus Google Gemini from obviously from Google, Anthropic. People typically say, oh, what do we need to do to secure these models? And I tell them, I wish there was one thing that you could do to secure the model, but it is different. What people have to do first is to establish what is the use case or the use cases, because that use case creates an interaction between the model and users and data and systems. And so each use case is unique. For example, what I was talking about before is like a large language model, which is now exposed to customer complaints. Okay, that's a complete unique use case. So the input is a complaint, and there are a set of guardrails that you want to implement on that. If you were doing something different, you would have a different set of guardrails. So for me, the biggest takeaway point for people is to think about what are the risks of my use case and what do I need to do to prevent those risks. Now, we published what we call an LLM application security canvas. It's essentially a set of guardrails that people can implement on the use cases depending on what matters, but typically just at a high level. So at least I give an answer which is not as generic and non-answering as the one I just gave you. The most common things that we find people are missing when they implement GenAI use cases. So number one, they don't have architectural controls outside of the LLM to prevent malicious actions. So what I'm saying here is that you have to assume that the LLM will either make a mistake or an hallucination, or an attacker will manage via attacks like prompt injection to make it do something that you did not expect. So the output of the generative AI is essentially untrusted, which means that whatever you are doing downstream with that output, you need to check. You need to check, is this operation allowed in the context of this use case. Does it make sense? So that's the first thing that I tell people, that you need to have controls outside of the generative AI, which are very specific to the use case you're developing, to check whether a certain action, especially when LLMs are taking actions, if that action should be allowed. And it shouldn't depend on you telling the LLM, don't do this, because it doesn't matter if you tell the LLM not to do that, an attacker will probably manage to get the LLM to still do it.
I think it's really interesting that a lot of companies are trusting a great deal to LLMs, right? That LLMs have absolute control, that they're reliable tools. And, if you take something off the shelf like a ChatGPT or a Claude or whatever, I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of these systems are still quite experimental and you need to have control over them, right?
Absolutely. And I think if you put aside my cybersecurity experience and what I was saying in the context of cybersecurity, if you want to really take advantage of LLMs and generative AI, you typically, it's not as easy as taking an off-the-shelf LLM and writing a prompt with 10 words and expecting that that's going to solve your problem. Typically, you're going to take that problem, you are going to split up into subsections or subcomponents, and then you're going to have a lot of prompt engineering for the specific component with a lot of examples from your specific use cases and data of what you want the LLM to produce. And then you're going to string all of these things together and add all of the checks in between to try and get the output where you want it to be. But I think one of the mistakes companies do at the beginning is that they think, we can just throw generative AI at this problem. But what does it mean to throw generative AI at a problem? There is a lot of context engineering, problem engineering. What information am I going to make available to the LLM for what particular task? What is good for an LLM to do versus what we don't need to use an LLM for? And how do you combine all of these things together? So I think people should really think about how you split a larger problem and use case into individual components, which then you can potentially use generative AI to solve, but with a lot of this data and context engineering so that you get answers which tend to be better. And that applies to cybersecurity as well, of course. Like the cybersecurity is just one aspect of your system.
Yeah, look, I think there is so much there that is really, really sage advice. I mean, one of the things that we come at the market with Donato is this idea about specific intelligence, and we talk about how LLMs offer these frontier models that give you amazing capabilities, but you have to apply it to your context, to your industry, in an environment that's safe and that you own and you control. And I think you're saying very similar things. It's like just an LLM call is not enough to be able to use it in a production environment in your business, right? If you're going to get it to take action for you. And so, I think it's really, 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 really helpful advice for everybody, because I think the whole world is kind of figuring out where do we start. And I think what you're really saying is that companies need to start by really having ownership, right, over some of the outcomes, the security, understanding where the risks are, understanding the guardrails that they can put in from a technical perspective. Yeah, really, really, really interesting. I guess with that in mind, I mean, we've talked a lot about the risks around AI, right? And I think the audience are going to, in many respects, are going to really, really appreciate having the balance of risk and reward. And, we've had a number of episodes where it's all about reward. So this is going to be really, really helpful for the audience to see the downside. But I guess to lift it up a little bit, where do you see the biggest opportunities in AI right now, from your perspective, given the 50 plus businesses that you're seeing implement AI use cases, or like you say, even more now, right?
So I mean, it depends on the type of business. I think the opportunity there is definitely helping to speed up some processes that would typically take a long time. Generative AI is very good with handling, with producing text, producing data. And I think there is a lot of what we do which is related to that. Like, if you have a company that does a lot of reporting, some of it can be made much faster with generative AI, for example. That's just one case where I think, it works really well. Anything to do with language and language translation is very good. Anything to do with categorization, like, you have queries coming in from your customers and you want to try and answer them quickly. You want to understand what the customer is saying in natural language and to take an action. That's actually, these are good use cases. And I think that there are big opportunities there. If I had to tell people, probably my bit of advice to be able to take the opportunity without incurring into high risks, I think you can use generative AI to its maximum potential if you know what good looks like. So if you ask generative AI to write a report based on some data that you're feeding in, that's okay. But if you don't know what good looks like and you don't have a way to determine whether the output meets your criteria and is correct, then Gen AI is a disaster for you. The Gen AI is a disaster in the hands of people that ask it to do a task that they don't understand what good looks like. But if you understand what good looks like you're a software developer, you've been developing software, you can QA. You can look at a piece of software and know if it's good or not because you do that as part of your job. Then you can ask generative AI to do it, and that's going to speed up a lot. And I talk about software development because that's technical thing that I do, and that helps me a lot. But if I didn't know what good software looked like, I would just be deploying AI slop. But because I kind of know, hopefully, what good software is like, I am able to get the value out of it because I'm able to reject what doesn't work or fix it. But then that makes me much faster because the scale at which I can get software done is much faster by using generative AI. And that's just one example that's personal for me. I never want to go back to writing all my software by hand. But again, you need to know and be able to look at whatever is produced by the generative AI and figure out whether that meets your quality standard. And if you can do that, then it's going to make you much faster and efficient.
Yeah, I mean, there are really two key themes I think that are worth pulling out from what you've said there. I guess one is that, AI is not at a place yet where it can replace people. I know a lot of people have fears around that, but actually, I think if you're working with it every day, you can see that it's an amazing augmenter and it can really help, like you say, accelerate repetitive work and work which is probably a bit monotonous. I guess the second theme though is also about building on the guardrails point. It's about human in the loop. Right? Like you need a human to be able to validate whether the outcome or the output is actually good. And without that, that's probably where a lot of companies introduce risk, right? Where it's almost like a blind faith in AI, which I think a lot of people aren't recognizing.
Well, and if I have to say something not controversial, but like an opinion which is my opinion and not the opinion of my employer for sure, what I would say is that right now you have like leaders and CEOs of companies that are pushing AI and are creating a narrative around it which confuses people. They seem to be extremely comfortable with making claims which are completely unsubstantiated in reality, like telling you in next year we're going to have AGI and we have PhD level intelligence. And I think that people should be very wary of those claims, especially people should go back just last year and look at the claims of some of these CEOs and see how many of them have materialized. Now, it doesn't mean Gen AI is not a useful tool, but be very careful to adopt Gen AI thinking that you have now a PhD level employee in your company, because the thing cannot, it is not a comparison. Like a bird is not an airplane, and it's a different type of thing. Yeah, they can both fly, but they ain't the same thing, right? So a lot of that confusion, I think, is created by the marketing departments of some of these companies with exaggerated claims, and everybody should be wary of them.
I love that. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, everyone loves the Superman mantra, but it's actually really relevant because there are analogs you can draw, like you say, but it's important to know where the limitations of AI are, right? And I think a lot of companies, like you say, are perhaps not quite aligned with what AI can do today versus what they probably imagine. But like you say, that's not to say that organizations shouldn't be leaning in and starting to adopt AI. They just need to be thoughtful about what are the outcomes they want to achieve, right? And can those outcomes actually be achieved with the technology in its current shape? I think that's a really pragmatic point and something we see a lot, right? Managing expectations and being able to help companies really build strong business cases around what AI can actually do versus maybe what people are imagining, you know?
Well, I mean, that's how they're justifying all of the huge investment. I think they are kind of raising billions for, because the promise that they have is this incredible AGI. I don't know if that's going to be happening. What I know is the technology we have today in the hands of capable people is very helpful. It's something that could help a business really function more effectively. The technology that they are promising will come just next year. Well, I am not sure that that technology is even possible, but I work with what we have today and what's real today. And I think if people do that, understanding, as you said, the limitations and how to work around them to actually get value, they will definitely see the value. But again, some of these other companies, they're trying to get money to an investment into a technology that they don't have yet.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, this has been really fun, Donato. We're going to get to our quick fire session now. I've actually asked you what the biggest opportunity in AI is right now already, so we can skip that question. I think you had some really thoughtful things to say. I guess moving on to our last two questions, if you were to offer a piece of advice that could help a leader listening right now get started with AI, both from a security context or even broader from a technology context, what would that one piece of advice be?
Think use cases rather than just, okay, we have to use generative AI. Think of what are the pain points and what are the use cases you might want to implement, and evaluate very quickly if generative AI is going to be able to help you with that. And don't think it's going to be one prompt and 1 week of somebody creating a prompt and that's it. Think about processes, tools, agents, all of these complex pipelines that can actually solve problems for you using your data and your context.
Brilliant. I think that's awesome. I think, at times it can feel so abstract, AI. So helping companies just have that in mind, like, what is it going to help you with? What is the problem you want to see it solve? I think that's really, really helpful advice for everybody. And I guess taking us to our last question, as a leader, are there any books or blogs or any media that you would recommend that's really offered, good mental models to you when it comes to thinking about change, technology, the people aspect that comes with making these big changes?
So I will probably give a slightly different answer because I am more in the technical world than in the C-level world, although I do work very often with C-level. But I love to understand how technology works. And so I would say there is a YouTube channel, which is my YouTube channel, and you can find a lot of information there. I do a lot of videos on generative AI and generative AI security. I try to cover what are the problems, but I'm not just doing a plug for my channel. I think in general, really like, and every leader should try actually to do that, to understand what the technology is to a degree, because that's the best way to make sure that you actually understand what's going on, rather than just saying AI, AI, AI. If you understand a little bit what that actually is, it will help you as a leader as well.
Love that answer. Absolutely love it. I think you're right. Like, there's no better way to get confidence on a space than just being intellectually curious and learning about it. And honestly, Donato, plug away. We will include your podcast link in the show notes. And also, as well, if you could share the framework that you discussed earlier, I think that would be really awesome for the audience because, every company needs to be thinking through the security considerations. And yeah, I think it could be really value add. So thank you for paying that forward, Donato. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it. How have you found it?
Thank you very much for having me. This was like fantastic, and I really enjoyed myself as well. Like, very good conversation.
Brilliant. All the best, Donato. Thank you so much.
Thank you.